All right, everyone, we are back with our Christian formation, and this time we're doing a series on Bible studies. So if you're with us here, thank you for being here. If you're with us online, we're glad you could be here with us in spirit as well. So for those here, we've got our handy sheet here with kind of the outline of what I'm going to talk about. And for those looking at this online, this will be available on my blog page. So there's a lot of different ways to do Bible studies, and one thing I wanted to do is to offer some methods that you could use. And these are all things you don't necessarily need someone who's got a background or is an expert in the Bible or anything like that. Sometimes that helps, but you don't necessarily need that. So these are just tools that anybody can use, and hopefully can be of help to anyone who wishes to use them. So the first of our three methods that we're going to talk about, our three methods are the academic method, discussion method, and lectio divina. And I'll talk about some other things too. Those aren't the only ones, but those are just the main ones that I want to talk about today. So we're going to talk about on the first page the academic method. So the academic method works exactly like you think it would. It's an academic way of going about Scripture. And the idea there is that you have one person who's a leader of the group, or at least of a session for the group. And this person looks at the text really closely. And how closely you want to look at that, how deep you want to dive in, is really dependent on the leader and really dependent on the group. That can just be like a very close reading, like you would for, say, a book study or a book report. You're just looking at the text, you're reading it closely. Presumably, you've got a Bible edition that's got some notes, and you're referring to those. So that's the least of what you need to do for it. If you want to get really into it, you can go into commentaries, and there's all different kinds out there. Obviously, some are better than others. Some are better for some people than others. The first one I can think of is the New Pillar, and that's a very good, very easy to access Bible's commentary series. But there's many out there that you can choose from. So that might be one source a leader might utilize. If you get somebody who's really, really knowledgeable, they might be digging into primary source materials. So that would be like the Greek and the Hebrew that they would be studying. So the Greek for the New Testament, Hebrew for the Old Testament. There's other books out there about Scripture, about various books in Scripture. There's always other sources, other thinkers, theologians, like Henry Nouwen or C.S. Lewis, that can be helpful as you're thinking about things too. But this is kind of the primary things that you need: a leader, and then figuring out how closely you want to dive in and study the text. I'll say I've seen Bible studies like this, some in fact that are lay-led, so not necessarily a clergy-led one, that are really, really in-depth, that I've looked at and thought, wow, I don't know that I can be that in-depth. And then others that are still meaningful. I don't want to say that they're not, but that they don't go in as deep and looking at these like nitpicky little things in language and things like that. But they are still diving deep into what the text is saying. So what are some advantages for using this method? Basically understanding what the words are saying. One of this is like the literal meaning of the passage. That's where somebody who has biblical language knowledge is really helpful for. So not just knowing what the translation's saying, knowing what the actual words said. Sometimes, depending on who you have, who's going over this, you can really get into the cultural context of the passage, and I think that can really help increase our meaning, our understanding of the meaning behind whatever passage you're going through for the study. And then it can also help understand the scholarly work that's out there, which is always interesting, I would say, depending on what you're hoping to get out of the passage. Maybe not always important, but like I said, always interesting to see like what are scholars today or in the recent past saying about this. And the last thing for this method, like what's going to help you utilize this method in the best way possible? Basically, a leader with time. Somebody who has the time to take to study really closely. And like I said, this doesn't have to be someone who's an expert, although it can work better depending on what you want out of this, what you want out of a study like this. It can be better with somebody who does have a background in Scripture, or somebody who is an expert. And I don't mean like somebody like me with an MDiv. I mean somebody with like a doctorate in biblical studies or something like that. I think one of the things that really helps is you've got somebody who's engaging, somebody who's going to bring you in, that's going to make you want to listen to what they have to say. That, I would say, is probably the most vital, aside from having a leader who's willing to take the time to do the study needed. You've also got to have members who are willing and want to have an academic focus, and that may not be what's best for you. That may not be what's best for the group. But it may be too. So that's something else to think about. Like what are you and your other members of this Bible study hoping to get out of this? I think really important on that note is willing to meet people where they are. So as I've said earlier, for some people you are going to want they're going to want to dive in. They're going to want to know all the Greek and Hebrew words and all their meanings and all of that possibly, yeah. And then some people are not necessarily going to want that, and that's not necessarily going to be helpful. So if you want something academic, let's say figure out how far do you want to go with that? How far is your group willing to go? Because that'll affect how many people you have, who you have, and what your leader does. You might have a leader who can go more academic or can go less academic. So that's something to keep in mind too. So that's it for the academic method. The next method on your next page is the discussion method. So how this works, basically you've got a group that's going to gather. Every week, you could gather more often or less often if you wanted to, but I think meeting every week is a good amount of time. And this is not something you necessarily have to do. I know I have it on the outline, but I think it's something that helps. Is if you have one or more members who come in, who maybe have looked at the text once or twice, and have a question. Another way you could do this is just to get together, read the passage, and somebody come up with a question they want to talk about. And the reason that I say this, and part of this is my own background in a discussion-based school, is that if you have a question, that's a really good starting point. You don't necessarily need to answer the question, although you may want to. And you don't necessarily have to talk about that question the whole time. But that whatever question you want to start off with can open up the next realms of possibility for what's going on. And then what you would also have after you have some sort of starting point in the discussion then all of your members of your group are going to get together to talk about what's going on here. What might this text mean? Possibly what might this text be saying to me? So what are the advantages of this method? You've got everyone who's involved. Something you can get with the academic method, although this depends on your teacher, is that it's just one person just spitting things out and telling you something. This really gets everyone involved and participating. Another advantage, you don't really have to have special knowledge to participate, which actually can sometimes be very helpful to learning. Because you don't have to go in and think, oh, well, I don't know anything about this particular passage, but I need to seem like I know something, or else people are going to realize that I don't know as much as I seem to, or something like that. It's not like that at all. For this method, I think it can help create an environment where you can ask those questions that most people are probably wondering too. But sometimes we don't always have the courage to ask those kind of questions because we don't want to look foolish. But this is a method that can really allow that, because you don't have to know anything, because you are trying to dive in and figure out together what's going on. You don't have to prepare a lot for this method too. That's another advantage. Like I said, it can help if you've got some sort of question or framework for discussion before you get there. But if that's something that's difficult for your group, you can always just come up with stuff while you're there. Because I think for most of us, when you really listen to a passage in Scripture, you're going to think, what did Jesus mean by that? Or what did Paul mean by that? Or what was God actually doing here, in this passage? Those questions can sometimes just come up naturally. I think another great advantage of this is you can hear the passage from different perspectives. And what I mean by that, like, different people are going to have different questions, they're going to have different thoughts, and people may have a question that you think, I never really thought of that, but that's a really good question. Or they may have things that they say that you think, I'd never thought of that before. That makes a lot of sense. And that's something I've seen done really well in some Bible studies, particularly thinking back to some. If you've got people who are really faithful. I remember one person who she wasn't a scholar. She didn't have an MDiv or a doctorate or anything, but she was very faithful, and she had these just really amazing questions and thoughts that really, really made you think about what was going on in the passage. And I always appreciate those kind of thoughts that pop up personally, but I really appreciated this particular person and her perspective too. So, and it was not mine; it was completely different. And that is often really helpful, is hearing different thoughts and ideas. Let's see. What do you need to make this particular method, the discussion method, work well? You gotta have people that are willing and willing to be active. And that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is talking all the time. You can have people that are just there listening, but you want people who are listening to say something when they feel the need to. So that's important too. And then really just guidelines can be really helpful for discussion. You don't want people who are going to speak over others or who are going to interrupt, but sometimes having a natural, organic conversation means that somebody's saying something and you throw out an idea. So figuring out how you work as a group is really vital to make this work, but also to come in and say, okay, these are the expectations for how we're going to treat one another here. That's important too. And then the last of the main methods I want to talk about is Lectio Divina. And I'm going to go through, this is based on something I've written up before, but a little more geared towards doing this for group method. But this is just kind of a step-by-step of how you would do Lectio Divina. So first you're going to take a verse or a passage of Scripture. So it doesn't matter, you can do this with a longer passage or even a shorter passage. You're going to read it aloud, and doing this in a group, it helps if you cycle who's reading. So maybe have one person read first, maybe have somebody read a little bit later. But that first time you're reading through, think about a phrase that sticks out at you. Up to about, well, a phrase being, that could be 3 or 5 words, it could be a little bit more, but just what's a phrase that sticks out with you, and write that down. And it helps if you've got a little bit of time, several minutes after the reading, for everybody to stop and think for a little bit. I often in this method too will, to get that immediacy of what the Spirit's saying, I'll, if it's printed out, I'll draw a line under whatever passage I'm thinking of. So that can help too. But having that thought afterwards is helpful. Then read through the passage again. And again, it helps if you've got a different person do it this time. And then this time, just pick one word that sticks out to you. So just one word. So going from the phrase to just the word. And again, give some time, give a few minutes to think that through. Then after that, you're going to want to read through the passage one last time. And after this time, and this it helps to think about after you've read the passage. Once you've read that passage, think about that phrase and that word that came to mind before, and reflect on what's maybe God trying to say to you in that moment through that passage of Scripture. And then I think what really helps with the group is to share and discuss after that what it is you think that God may be saying to you. Again, and then this is more helpful if you do it on a voluntary basis. Not forcing anyone to do anything, but if people feel willing to share, I think that can be good. And then, particularly because then you can take what everybody's saying. The weird thing is oftentimes you find that one or more people, sometimes even everybody in the group, will be thinking the same thing. So then you can reflect on all of what you've heard, what God might be saying to you. Also, I should note, and this will be noted later in the notes here, this is just a method I have found particularly helpful for Lectio Divina, but there's a lot of different methods out there that can be similar or different to this. Again, this is kind of what I developed through reading a few books, but also from my experience with it and from what I got out of from my own experiences doing Lectio Divina. So this is, but like I said, there's more methods. You don't have to stick to this, but this is what I found particularly helpful. And I should say too, Lectio Divina literally means divine reading. So it's a divine reading of Scripture. So the advantages of this method, and if I'm being fully honest, I'm very biased towards this. I really like Lectio Divina. So I think I think this is a particularly helpful method. And one of the big advantages, there's no preparation you need beforehand. In fact, the method I think is stronger when you go in kind of with a clear head and just go in, see what God is trying to say to you in that moment. That's another advantage. This allows you to really focus it gives you the time and allowing you to focus too. Um, but it is a really good method to just stop and listen to what God is saying to us through Scripture. Um, like I said, there's multiple methods out there, and that's another advantage. If one method might work for one group for this better than another, so you can try different things. And another thing, if you don't want to use this as a Bible study method, you don't have to. You can actually just use this on your own. This is a great method because it lends itself to being used either as with a group and as a group, or just as an individual by yourself. See, and okay, so what do you need to use to make this method successful, to use it well? Have some sort of form for Lectio Divina, like have your method out there for people to use. I've got a separate document that has what I have in front of you and what I'll have online printed out in just a one-page format. And I just did that for another class, but also for if anybody ever wanted something like that. I've got this for you here. This is available. So having something printed out helps for people to use, and then it allows them to use it on their own if they want to too. I think another thing that really helps, this one, it doesn't take a lot of preparation, but it does take time when you're together. So making sure you have that extra time to process and to listen to what's going on in whatever passage of Scripture you're going through. And then, of course, like all of these methods, you need people that are open to using it, that think, hey, this might be a really good method for us to use. So these are the three methods I've focused on, but there's other methods too. It isn't just limited to this. I've got a couple of other examples of how you can take some of these methods and use them. I'm sure if you talk to somebody else, they'd come up with a completely different list, and that's okay. But these are particularly good ones, and I think these here have some basis in what we've seen before already. One of these other methods is the small group method. And the nice thing about this is if you get together with a small group, so this is assuming you have a group that you meet with regularly, that they're the same people. Like I said, you meet with regularly, maybe once a week, maybe once a month, but just some group of people that you meet with regularly. And you can come together and you can either do something that's academic or discussion-based. One of the things that I've seen that I think is particularly well done for this method is having each member of the small group take turns. And often what I've seen with this is the group will get together, they'll say, what book do we want to go through? And then each week a different person takes over leading. And that's good just because the preparation's not all on one person, and everybody gets a chance to get their say in and get their perspective in there. One thing I've seen often with this method too is that groups will, while they're going through, say, Genesis or John or a book like that they'll have some sort of resource that they can use there, a commentary or something like that. And that's something that everybody uses, so that everybody's more or less on the same page on that too. So that's one idea. And again, you can use the academic method, you can use the discussion method, you can use a blend of either of those with a small group. And the last one is another method I'm particularly fond of, like Lectio Divina, and that's the Ignatian method. So this takes its basis from Ignatian spirituality, which is basically this works best if you have a passage that's not just a psalm per se, but it's a story. It works really well with a story, and the idea here is you listen to the story. and you think, okay, of all these different characters, which one do I identify with the most, and why? And I think that can be a really helpful method. It makes you realize that Scripture is still speaking to us, sometimes very directly. It helps put you in the mindset of the story too. This method, I've not personally used this in a group. This is something I've used by myself or under the guidance of a spiritual director. But I think it is something that could be used with a group. But one thing that would be very vital for this would be being in a trusting and safe environment. Because you're putting yourself in the shoes of another character, and that shouldn't be a bad thing for us. Sometimes we might realize, oh, maybe I need to work on this, that, or the other. But that's something that can be helpful to us. But you want to be in an environment where you feel open. You feel you can be open and you can trust people because you are bearing a lot about yourself. Thinking, for example, the story in the Gospels with Martha versus Mary. So Martha is in the kitchen making sure everything's ready, and she gets mad at Mary sitting at Jesus' feet studying. And you've probably heard a lot of sermons that people have done on being a Martha versus a Mary or Mary versus Martha. There's good things about both of those qualities. I think it's helpful for us to realize at times that we may go in one direction or another, and maybe to find a balance between those two qualities. But you could have people that would say, like, oh, well, aren't you actually this? Or like, you're that. I'm not sure that's a good thing. And you don't want that. You want to be able to be open with people about that and trusting and not feel judged with that too. So these, again, are the methods that I think are particularly helpful for Bible study. And my hope is for y'all here and for those listening to this on the internet, that this can be helpful to you if you wish to start a Bible study with folks here at St. Paul's or in the community or with other people in other churches. That's my hope, is that this will be like a starting off point for you. I am gonna stop the recording now, so thank you for our internet folks, and I just want to say before I do that, that I hope you keep listening, and next week we're going to start off going through examples of these. So we'll spend the rest of the month going through those first three examples, our academic method, our discussion method, and Lectio Divina. And next week, and this will be recorded too, we'll be going through the academic method, specifically with the first part of John chapter 8. So thank y'all who are here. Thank you for listening. It's going to be our question time, so I'm going to turn this off and tune in next week. Thanks again.